So basically, this talk is about the animation tech that we did for, and we still do for the VR team, but specifically with a focus on the stuff we did for the Climb game. The story, at least for animation tech on the Climb, starts back with Back to Dinosaur Island. With Back to Dinosaur Island, we wanted to showcase the power of CRYENGINE, but also uniquely when it came to VR. So at the very start of it, we wanted to convey the uniqueness of the VR medium, which to us translated into scale, hence dinosaurs, but also the freedom of movement you have on your head, not just in turning and rotating the camera, but also in displacing yourself. So we knew right away that regular animations, just scripted stuff, would not be enough, and we needed to have more interactive movement that comes with the freedom of having a headset rather than just a mouse and keyboard. And so, at least as far as animation tech was concerned, the key moment became that close-up with the dino. There's a lot of other important things that go on in providing a sense of scale, but most of it relate to rendering. When it came to animation, the key idea was to have the dino react to what you're doing. And it couldn't be just reacting to where you're looking, because that was something you could easily achieve with a mouse. And so here you can see that for the key moment, the idea was to have the dino react to the tilt of your head and its position. When you tilt your head a bit, the dino would act a bit delayed and also tilt its head in response. When we showed this at GDC, it was for us a very minor sort of feature, but what it gave us from feedback was that everyone absolutely loved it. People would talk about the dino and they would talk about the, I think it was a firefly or a butterfly. There was also, you had to dodge with your head. Two features that are very unique to VR. And you can't easily have them with just a mouse that moves around, because you actually have to get your head out of the way and displace it so that it can show you this ability. What it also taught us is that it was super fun for people to test, but it was absolute nightmare to implement. This is the dino head tracking tilting on its own. This is not even the movement. This is not anything else. This is just the tilt. Now, the reason we have this is that we were working with raw IK. We would just set a target and move it in space, which is the absolute last node you can see at the very end here. All the rest of this was making sure it blended in and out. It interacted smoothly. It picked the time in the animations. And if you do this by just setting an IK target for a character, it very quickly became a nightmare. So Back to Dinosaur Island gave us two very important things: that VR requires very unique interaction moments. People love the freedom of having to move their head, weave it, and tilt it, but that raw IK really belonged to the past. Sadly, this video is missing, but since most of you work here, you can probably check it out later. I'll try to fix it for the actual presentation. This was basically our first VR test run. This is way back when the VR team, I guess, was more or less me and Niels and 3 other guys. And we had this just running. It was basically VR rendering in the game SDK. It worked perfectly, but it was, as I say here, motion sickness bonanza. Everything was worse. From the inertia you get when you start or stop walking, to the head bob you get with the pistol. I don't know why this video is broken, but you can see it's a very big pistol that's bobbing up and down in front of your face all the time. And it made people immediately sick. Something like crouching or jumping or stopping because you hit a wall became very clearly a very bad idea. And even stuff that regularly in FPS we used to add all over the years in this industry to make more realism, like more inertia, even though your head actually has to react to these in real life, you're so used to your own inertia and you're so used to your head bob pattern that your brain does sort of a image stabilization and you don't feel them. That's why people very easily can tell when they're limping, because their brain knows this is not my regular pattern. So something like a forced pattern that is not yours but coming from the screen made people super sick. And the same goes with inertia. So our first task during these days was basically getting rid of all this. Nothing like head bob, nothing like inertia, nothing like delays on motion, nothing like tilting the head when you're turning. All of these had to go. During that time, one of our level designers, Matthias, also wanted to experiment with climbing. He was a climber, he wanted to experiment it, and he had a super simple prototype. But even back then, we realized that that prototype of climbing and being able to climb was super fun. Everyone liked it. We wanted to implement it. Naturally, we had to go through the regular steps. As you can see here, this is a blend space. So we had handcrafted animations of reaching to where to grab and where to ungrab. And you'd have a blend space, a 3D blend space, which had up, down, left, right, and depth forward of where that grip was. And you try to reach to it. These had three major problems. The first problem is all these animations worked on each shoulder independently. You could be grabbing with one arm and the rest of the body looked completely like you're standing still. And it was completely unrealistic. The second step, the parametric blend spaces are very good, they're very quick, but they are not accurate enough for VR. They may be accurate enough for you to get away with something like locomotion on a different character, but something like a hand climbing that is super close to you is not accurate enough. We could not get it to actually fit. And in VR, where you can tilt your head and get closer to your hand to check out where your exactly hand meets the geometry, it was very easily clear that most of the time your hand would miss the actual grip. The last problem, of course, is that it felt completely lifeless. Like, no matter what you're doing, no matter how strained you are, no matter what's happening in the game, this same animation tried to reach it at the same point, and if you cancel it midway, it had to reach back in the same process, and it felt completely lifeless. So what we tried next was we said, okay, then let's try the other way around. Let's try to go for complete IK control. By definition, complete IK control gave us very accurate results. We could get the hand exactly where we wanted, all the time, no problem. It had a major drawback, which was the exact opposite of handcrafted animations. It looks very mechanical, it's very linear. It looked like a robot was climbing. It's climbing very precise, but that's not what a human looks like. Also, the more we started to implement full IK on the arms, the more we get into less and less possibilities of doing something without breaking the bones and making the skeleton look bad. And that is why we went for weighted controls. Now this is a new feature that we have in CryEngine, which is the pose modifiers. The pose modifiers are basically a very simple but brilliant idea of having IK-driven transforms, but are completely controlled and data-driven by data. What this means is this is the skeleton that you see for the player, and if we take it out, you see that we have right hand and left hand targets. These right hand and left hand targets are what the game code communicates to these pose modifiers and to this skeleton layer as to where the hands should be. The second point, the second most important point actually, is the weight bones. We also have now right and left hand blend weight bones. These blend weight bones not only drive how much we blend, but most importantly, give the control of how much we blend at any moment to the animators. It gives it to the people who are in charge of the style, people who know how humans react, whose job is to make things look not robotic. So no longer did you have to suffer from linear blending or even smooth CD or spring blending, because none of these really act like a human. Instead, handcrafting these animations, the animators would also encode into these blend bones whether or not it's a good idea to move them now, whether or not they want full control of it, whether or not they should blend quickly at start or smooth at the end or vice versa. And they could easily transfer their style, sort of say, into the blend itself. Not just the animations, but also the blend. The second thing we did was basically cut off the hands. This was a very conscious decision, and we went along back and forth with it. But our lead programmer, Dario, had this very precise statement, and I agree with that the more strict and the more complete the simulation you make, the more fragile it is. That's why you can play a flight simulator for hours at an end, and it seems super good until something slightly weird happens and the physics just explodes. And so the more precise and the more strict your simulation, if you want to have an entire full body climbing up a mountain, the more fragile it becomes. And so not wanting to have bugs, you will keep down on cutting on things you can do and keep down on cutting on what you possibly could do because you're afraid that this might end up looking bad. Secondly, we were very conscious from the very start on the project that this was not a simulator. This was still going to be a fun game. And so gameplay had to come first. If there was a grip that we wanted to do or a part of the action that we wanted to achieve, and we couldn't because we had to sort of break the bones a bit, then we couldn't stop at that because we're not making a climbing simulator. We wanted something that was super fun, hyper real became the motto later on, but we wanted something that was still more fun. We're still making a game, we never claimed to make a climb simulator. Once we cut off the arms, then things became much easier to simulate and it gave us much more freedom. However, we still lacked any sort of feeling. You still have hands that were walking traversing the world very robotically. The thing we did next was purely cosmetic, but it made a huge difference. That should do. Anyway, assume it looped. What you see here is the hand orients itself. If it finds a surface that is close enough, it does orient itself according to the surface. And there's a simple additive animation here. When it finds a grip, then it can grip. But regardless, the most important part here is the hand is orienting itself, like someone who's actually trying to touch the world, which became later a motto that we used over and over again. And it gave the hands way more life, rather than just always floating around your head and around your face in a sphere. Yeah. The next step for us was that once we've separated these data-driven blend weights through the pose modifiers completely out into data, and all the gameplay code would do was take this code, take the gameplay, translate it into targets, and pass it to the player, we started to get more and more benefits. The first one was the separation of channels. The separation of channels meant that very easily we have this right hand, we have this left hand. The right hand can be doing whatever it's doing, the left hand can be doing whatever, and we have no problem interrupting them. The skeleton became completely gameplay driven. Also, it simplified our code, even in debugging. Every time we'd end up with a problem, it'd be very easy to identify, okay, is the target moving correctly? Yes, then this is clearly an animation problem. If not, then this is a gameplay problem. And this separation, this clear separation between game and animation code made our life much easier. Also, this is super easier. It made it super simple for us to incorporate touch controls. Because with touch controls, the most important thing for you is to always have the player control the hands. No matter what he does, just let the player control the hands. If he's doing something nonsensical, then it doesn't mind. If he can't reach a grip, that doesn't mind. It's just gameplay. And so with this separation, a very clear and easy way to do it was just to stop listening to the blend weights and assume they're on by all the time. So that means we could instantly have, at least from animation code, my work on implementing something for touch was super simple. If you wanted touch, just stop listening for the weights. You don't want touch and you want gamepad control, then listen for the weights and try to figure out what is doable. With this separation of left and right, I'm sorry for the video, I had to downsample it. It's super awful, but I'll probably have better videos later on. Okay, I'm getting it. What this allowed us is this separation meant that we could have independent actions on left and right hands. What you're seeing here is that, again, okay, the right hand would be climbing, or in this case, the right hand first would be climbing, and on the left hand, if you wanted to do something like chalking, which is one of the gaming mechanics we have, that was super simple. The blend weights would go down on the, I really should get rid of that house. The blend weights would go down on the left hand, and then the chalking animation would play, and it would play nicely, and then you'd go back into IK control. The next step with that was, now that we've separated this, and now that we have blend weights, each weight by default is a joint. And a joint means it has three-dimensional positions. It has an X, Y, and Z. Traditionally, we've always used these blend weights as a channel for just the X. The next step was separating these channels into position and orientation. Why do we always have to treat IK as a whole thing? Let's treat it independently. And the first advantage we got from this was something like the watch. We wanted a simple in-game. If you notice, the entire game relies on very in-world UI. And so the best way to check time when you're racing or when you're climbing is to really just check your own watch. And so what we wanted to do is not separate the position. We want the watch to still go somewhere in front of your face, but it has to rotate under the animator's influence. And so here, you can see on the left hand, the animator can very easily, independent of the game or the game code or even the animation code knowing what is going on, the animator can take away the weight that signifies rotation, but keep the weight that says position. And so we know once it's a watch action, we can actually, Yeah, I think you've seen it. We can get the hand to go in front of your face because we know where the head bone is, but still have the animators control the weight. So this is the benefit of separating the X and Y coordinates, and we can go with Z and more, but we didn't really have more use for it, to do weight versus position independent control. The next big part was that if we are also going to be use X and Y values or X, Y, and Z values, then we can even get more bit compression quality out of it. Instead of using one joint per weight, we are now using just the one axis per weight. But that's not all. Like, the other next assumption was that always 100% on the X or the Y or the Z would make us consider it as a full blend. But there we had another chance in the pose modifier to signify, no, let's actually give the animators the choice to signal what would be a positive and what would be negative value. So sometimes for some pose modifiers, you'd say that 100% would be the X at 100, and sometimes 100% would be the X at 0. So what you're seeing here is the slipping animation. It's one of the gameplay mechanics where if you press incorrectly and don't have enough chalk, your hand slips. What this is doing, it's actually using two independent pose modifiers working not against each other, but almost oblivious of each other. One of them is trying to place the hand exactly where you want to be. The other is trying to pull the hand down according to physics, just to give it a small nudge down and then allow it to go back up. And what you're seeing here, again, a bit slower, is the same. Once this animation starts, this animation takes the X value from 100 full control down to 0. So it hereby disables this precise positioning. However, it also enables the physical impulse to work. And that's why you get this smooth transition, and the animators can very quickly encode in the animation the type of transition they want. They can have a very quick transition at the start, which shows your hand actually slipping, and then a calm return back to normal. The last problem we had, which was obvious from the very start, was the big, scary, vicious thing for VR animations, is that full body motion control. Everyone is always scared of full body motion control, and you should be. If you've ever tried a regular game that was not built for VR, and you go to like an obstacle and do a climb animation, it's absolutely horrible. It makes you instantly sick because you do this sequence that is telling your brain all sorts of inputs while your body is telling your brain that, no, I'm still seated down in my chair. So for us, the last part of climbing over the top ledge, reaching the end, was very significant. We wanted a very different thing. We didn't want to just keep on climbing and then suddenly, oh, I'm done. We wanted something that signified to the player, you've made it. You've made it to a checkpoint, you've made it to the end. So in the end, we did actually get to work with full body, full motion control. However, the trick here was being very subtle with what we did. What we did is move the body rather quickly. However, we at no point take neither positional control from the headset. If you have an offset from where the headset center is, we still applied it to the top ledge. We did not take any control from that, so the player during that transition could still move his head around. And we never took away orientation. When you're climbing, if you look to the side, you'll probably feel more nauseated. However, you're very likely to feel less nauseated than if you try to turn your head and the on-screen, in-game, nothing happened. So the most important things for us was fast is usually better than slow. A very slow motion, while it might seem more intuitive to go slow, these slow motions kind of disrupt the brain. And anything usually under half a second, the brain barely notices, and it can ignore. If it's like, oh, it's under half a second, it's a really quick motion, but none of my sensors told me that, I'm fine with it. The second thing is, don't restrict the camera. Don't take control of the in-game camera. A lot of the animations that are full motion have the camera traditionally in FPS doing very fancy stuff. You look down as you're putting your hand, and you look around if you're closing the vehicle door. That is really bad. You can have the animation do that, but make sure not to take control from the player. Let the player look where they want and apply the offset they want. Secondly, of course, don't do complex motions. Like this transition in its heart is literally just a linear motion. It's a bit curved to give it more life, but it's literally just from point A to point B. There's sometimes a little bit of rotation correction, but it's super simple motions. There's no zigzag, there's no stepping over something, and there's not much complex motion going around. It's just literally a linear traverse. And yeah, so in conclusion, what we found through the climb, I'm probably going to keep on, yeah. Procedural animations are very much a necessity for VR. They are never going to replace handcrafted, stylistic animations. Animators are, this VR and procedural animations are not here to replace animators, but it's just to give it that extra edge. In VR, it is very easy to get close to everything, to get close to that creature's foot and figure out if it's really on the ground or not. It's very easy to check if your hand really does rest on that button when you're pressing it, because you have no control of where the player is. So procedural animations are very much a necessity for VR. Most of the realism we have from FPS games are there because you're playing with a 2D monitor. You're not playing with something that is strapped to your face, and your brain is not assuming this is what I'm seeing. If you've ever tried VR, I'm assuming most people have at some point at least seen a demo, you realize that your brain, after a very short time, stops seeing this as a screen I'm looking at, but because it's all you see, your eyes literally treat it as this is what I'm seeing, regardless of the aesthetic of the game you're playing with. So something like motion bob, inertia, or tilt when you're rotating, very traditional things that are done for regular FPS games, are a killer because your brain feels like something is different than what I'm expecting, hence maybe I'm sick. Raw IK is a huge pain to work with. Regardless, this is maybe the only point that is not really relevant to VR, and it's relevant to both of them. Raw IK is a huge pain. There is no such thing as a mathematical blend that is as nice as what an animator can encode in your blends. Linear blends don't work. You might get away with them if they're super quick, but they don't work. Parabolic and smooth CD and spring work on objects. They will never work on a creature. Any creature you see is way more complex than just a set of springs. So while they might work to correct something, they are generally not a good idea. And it's really almost costless to always add an element of weighted blend to the animator so that the animator can control how to blend it, when to blend it, and they can also take control of, now the shouldn't say dino. Now the creature is doing an overly complex animation. Let's not set the blend weights to 0 so that we guarantee that IK is not going to corrupt the animation. The last one, maybe the second one, also not relevant only to VR, is really separate your game and animation code. Gameplay, AI, animation, audio, physics, all of these are super complex on their own. You do not want to be dealing with bugs early or later in the project where you can't figure out what is wrong. There is usually a major problem once you still figure out what is wrong, how to correct it. So separating your game and animation code, just you have a game code that just decides that this is what the game is doing, this is what you're playing, and an animation code that responds to it and tries to match it with animations is a huge time saver and just boost for productivity. You can very easily check if the game is where it expects to be, then it's animation code, and if the animations are responding correctly but the game is sending wrong information, that is gameplay code, and it makes just everyone's life easier. VR is not as restrictive as people, myself included, initially thought. It's just a completely different medium. It is not going to cancel out all the things we know. It's just completely new. You need to approach it like you're approaching a new medium. Like they say, 3D games are here and they've been here for a couple of decades, yet you still have 2D games. You still have side-scrollers. You still have platforms. VR is probably, in my opinion, it's probably not worth much, not going to replace 3D. There's always going to be a place for 3D, fast movement, FPS shooters, or third-person games with tons of thematic animations. VR is just new. It needs to be different. It's very, very complex to get a game that was not designed for VR and implement VR into it. You're going to run across many things, and in the end, you're either going to sacrifice your implementation is going to be an awful game, or you're going to sacrifice comfort and people are going to get sick and just stop playing it in VR. And lastly, there is, not just on animation side even, but there's way more to VR than rendering. The rendering team we have blows my mind. They do stuff that to me seems like magic, but that's not all there is to it. You have to rethink every part of your game. You have to think the controls. You have to think the gameplay. You have to rethink the animations, the sound. Everything is different in VR, just like everything in 3D is probably different in 2D, not just for the rendering. And yeah, if you're not here from Crytek, you can join us. That'd be weird. Thank you. Yeah.